Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to Umlink Energy Speaks Back, powered by Harp. My name is Paul Webb. I'm the founder of B2B Energy, and I'm your host. And weekly, I present to you energy experts from around the world. Welcome to episode 84, where my special guest today discusses carbon-consuming supply chains and major steps towards net zero from farm to fork. Our purpose, as always, is to provide a good understanding of energy management knowledge from around the world, which is available today for us to deliver savings that impact on our planet. And on our journey to knowledge sharing, we would like to thank our sponsors, who are Watts for their electronics and EV transition, Carbon Black Global for their waste to energy initiatives, Cinefex for their insulation coating, Smart Cool for their AC initiatives, Umlink for taking the confusion out of energy management, Hark Systems, renowned for their energy software, Clean Energy Revolution for their knowledge and networking through LinkedIn, B2B Energy for the 11-week energy program, Lexus Energy for power management, Led by Vision for LED and controls. And lastly, our certificate partners, Esther Energy. Our special guest today is an expert in his industry. So without any further ado, I give you Jonathan Lodge. Good evening, and I'm sure it's good afternoon, Jonathan, today. How are you?
Thank you. Yes, it is good afternoon here. And yes, I'm fine, thank you.
So for the benefit of my audience, I've just landed in Thailand today from a 11-hour flight. So I'm a bit rusty around the edges. We've got the setup going, but as I say, I'm a bit rusty around the edges, and it's sort of coming up to 11 o'clock at night for me. Been a long day. So Jonathan, we've met through acquaintances, and we've obviously communicated via Zoom. So I've learned a little bit about your background to yourself. So for the benefit of our audience today, can you tell us your background and some of your origin story?
Okay, yes. So I was born down in Exeter and lived on the edge of Dartmoor for quite a while, where I soon realised that local food really was local, and milk possibly travelled further than the cow than the bottle. So as we moved up towards the Thames Valley, and I got more heavily involved and educated in design technology, but I kept always through that life a view of resource efficiency. And funnily enough, it was more recently when I got into the urban farming aspect, which really was being stuck behind a Tesco truck within sight of the nearest destination store. And when I finally got inside, I saw the fresh produce shelves were bare. So coming back to energy again, having shared a house with a heat and vent controls engineer, I knew full well what was going on, and there was just so much waste. And I thought something had to be done. And so with a bit of thinking, we've come up with a way that we just cut out huge elements of the supply chain. So we can grow to order at point of need and avoid the need for generating carbon dioxide, which is often done by running gas boilers all summer, simply for that reason, even if it means dumping the heat. And then a hugely complex carbon intensive supply chain, eventually that produce arrives at a store where they're already paying to dump carbon dioxide and heat. And I thought there could be something significantly different here. And so this really took me on a really exciting journey and ended up to where we are, with a significant advantage over those that are now realizing just how much energy really does cost them, rather than just they thought it was a lot recently. It's now enormous. And we need to address how to reduce the demand on energy rather than just to find a slightly better way of achieving things.
And are we talking the energy of gas, electricity, or we're taking it to the next levels regarding transport as well?
It's the transport aspect as well. One of our interns last year came up with a fascinating statistic. If you want to air freight lettuce, it costs 125 calories to deliver every calorie of lettuce delivered. And when you actually look at that, aiming to get to net zero at the farm gate achieves absolutely nothing when the overwhelming majority of it, funnily enough, very much like the different scopes of emission, where a lot of buildings are looking at scopes 1 and 2, but the majority of emissions, well over 90% are scope 3, and that's where we really have to address things.
And I find in my world, we're just really, and have been just focusing on scopes 1 and 2. Scopes 3 aren't really the focus, are they? I know we're using the word focus a lot here, but they're not, are they?
And that's one of the big issues I have found. So many people seem to think that, we'll reach net zero by signing a renewable energy contract and buying an EV. And yet the reality is, if that's less than 10% of your total emissions, it's a drop in the ocean of what's needed.
And sometimes when they're outsourcing the scope 3, they feel they don't need to worry about. But that's the idea of this, isn't it? Scope 3, you have to report.
I think a lot of people are going to be ended up doing double accounting.
Yeah.
So they account for their downstream, whilst their customers are also trying to take that into account, and then they're looking at upstream as well and saying, it works both ways on the supply chain, and you can't both take the saving.
You can both make the contribution. That's the problem, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, how are we going to? What are the solutions that you've come up with that you're working towards?
Well, literally, people talk of vertical farming, and bizarrely, I've heard someone else this morning that said, "Oh, how proud they are to have gained investment in vertical farming," when all they've done is lifted the rural business model of a glass house growing and stuck it in a very expensive city building, where all I can actually do is multiply costs. Yes, they've reduced and saved a few food miles, they call it, but all they've saved is the cheapest motorway mileage, where all the real issues are in the final mile. So we're looking at distributed growing and growing to order at the point of need. So avoiding the final mile actually allows you to avoid many other costs, whilst actually making the building more efficient as well.
Where does all the salads, we just focus on salads, where's all the salads in the world coming from currently?
For the UK, huge amounts are imported from Spain. And of course, we had the bottleneck, whether caused by Brexit or the French, of the Channel Tunnel. And so the time involved in transit. I've actually been into China, and it's Tonghai County, I think it is, not far south from Kunming, where the recent airplane crash was. That county actually controls the price of salads going into Thailand because they sell so much. But again, huge amounts of these leaves and other salads and herbs are actually harvested to survive the supply chain rather than for freshness and flavor.
Do you think the human nature of eating certain produces out of season has caused a big problem here?
That's a fascinating aspect of it. One of the claims of vertical farming is that they can grow all year round. But what they actually fail to forget is in the UK, salad demand halves in a winter. And it's not just a UK problem. It disappears in the Florida summer where they want to holiday somewhere cooler.
Right.
So you have the same issues in almost every major city around the world. They might be caused by the opposite extreme, but these variations in demand and supply are very much there.
Right. So it's not just the supply, it's also the demand. Is that what you're saying?
Well, this is my big bugbear with so many who look at maximizing productivity. We've got to grow more food, and they look at pushing the supply side, where actually most of the waste comes from the lack of matching that with the demand side. And that, I feel, is one of our significant advantages. But if you grow to order at point of need, you can actually vary harvest to cover short-term demand changes.
And then, so what produce are you looking at growing at the point of supply?
Well, this is another interesting aspect. One of the big problems of vertical farms is they've paid to homogenize their whole environment, but it actually restricts what they can grow to leafy your salad crops. But in actual fact, what you want is a wider range. So we aim to grow entire quantities of to match the demand of as many short cycle varieties as possible. And by taking advantage of free sunlight and varying the nutrient delivery and watering and other aspects like that, we can actually grow a wider range and actually play with growing cycles a bit, so we can help buffer those short-term demand changes as well.
Where these vertical gardens, is that right? Am I saying vertical garden? Is it a vertical garden?
Well, vertical farm, they like to call
vertical
them.
farm. Where are these vertical farms going to be sited?
Well, this is again, our unique selling point is that we can actually mount an automated greenhouse on top of any large commercial building. So my patents actually cover our ability to install on a non-load bearing surface, such as that of a modern retail warehouse. And that multiplies the number of rooftops we can install on, which is actually a huge saving over others who are, so many just seem to think they've got to start with a solid concrete base, which in a city is always going to be very expensive.
Then do we need to water these? Have they got water harvesting?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The more and more wild extremes of weather we have, a lot of buildings now are being charged to dispose of storm water runoff. In actual fact, as long as we can collect enough and buffer it, in many places we could run entirely on harvested rainwater. But obviously you need to buffer that and you have to take that into consideration. So it's always going to be a trade-off of what makes sense.
Yeah. And we're seeing some flooding areas around the UK, aren't we? So this could be a flooding solution, couldn't it, as well? Because you're taking that water and redirecting it rather than put it into the rivers. We're going to put it into vertical farming.
It can at times. Yes, it has to be done properly.
I know we're talking about significant amounts of water here, but don't the Dutch use this as some form of solution to help them with their flood scales?
They have a whole different situation, of course, where much of their land is below sea level. So they have some interesting aspects around salinity of water they can use as well, the salt content. But certainly, yes, the buffering supply and demand is the important aspect. And if you can take some of that surge off the systems in times of storms, it can make a significant difference. It's been one of my bugbears. My mum would tell you for decades I've spoken of how mad it has been that we've spent the last half of the 20th century trying to rush rainwater out to sea as fast as possible. And yet now we have land that is too dry. And there's even talk of irrigating arable land in Kent and places like that. We've got to rebuild the soil's ability to retain moisture.
It's funny you mentioned Kent, because isn't Kent renowned for its chalky based, so it's very limescale-y, isn't it? Does that cause us problems?
To be honest, I wasn't aware of limescale in Kent. It's far worse where I am in the Thames Valley.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, that's a very interesting point. And when you talk to some of the water specialists about how chalk streams clean dirty water, and I think there's a lot of ways in which I have heard one company that can virtually use that sort of a process as a catalyst rather than a filter. And all the detritus that we think of in dirty rain or storm water and will just drop out and precipitate out the bottom of the tank.
Yeah. So I was considering this to Dartford in Kent, which is right on the Thames Valley as such, where we've got the the issue regarding hardening of water, because Kent's a funny county, isn't it? It comes right up to into London, basically. So have you got case studies around what you've been doing?
We've got various aspects around it. It's quite funny, isn't it, how so many are trying to force nature, where we've always believed in nurturing nature rather than, it's a bit like a Formula One car, and the law of diminishing returns. You could deliver most of your salad on a bicycle. Why would you try and do it with a Formula One car? So growing of plants has been achieved for many millennia. And an interesting aspect around that is by actually shutting out everyday pest and disease, because you can shut most of that out very simply. We should perhaps be looking back at traditional cultivars, varieties of crops, rather than trying to breed new ones. And so we can actually return to flavor combinations. So yes, we've run small systems. We've proved we can run it with very low level computer power, and the amount of energy we need to run our systems is remarkably small, which has to be a benefit the way we're looking at the energy prices today.
And you're still going to be able to absorb the sun levels there, aren't you? You're not looking to enhance that in any way, the sun, are you? You'd be utilising that area.
There will always be a need for some supplemental lighting, but again, because we don't aim to grow everything all year round, we will only need to actually supplement lighting in smaller areas of our systems, which actually gives us greater flexibility, and we can grow what we want in those areas and grow other crops that there are plenty of winter crops that don't need much light, and we can encourage them rather than grow the same crop all year round.
I know Prince Charles was once looking at developing farming underground and in caves, wasn't he, using the likes of plasma lighting? I don't know where and how far they've got developing that scenario, but I have seen it.
Lots of people looking at growing underground in various different ways, but one that always surprises me is why they don't focus on plants that don't need light, or rather not so much plants as mycelium, mushrooms.
Yeah. And so the crops that you're looking to grow, what are those crops?
Well, funnily enough, everyone looking at expensive indoor growing started with basil, and that's a hugely popular crop and actually very interesting in many ways. So you start with something like, well, you always start with the high value crops if you've got higher costs, but the more you need to come down to the lower value crops. Although funnily enough, it's quite fascinating how value of a crop can often be dictated by its volume, or in other words, by how much you can load onto a truck to deliver it. And by growing at point of need, that's a point we break. That link is no longer important. So by cutting out the substantial cost of delivery, we can start to make healthy food more affordable. And rather than try and overcome the problem of food waste, when data can actually tell you that you shouldn't be paying to grow, pack and deliver what you know will be wasted, you can actually drop the overall price for everyone.
What sort of savings are we looking at? You mentioned before that you've done some calculations on this. What are the potential savings of doing this regarding, if we was to look at the carbon footprint, how much can we reduce our carbon footprint by doing this?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I quite like often to compare, to align carbon and cash. If you've cut out cash, you've automatically cut out carbon. And so again, if you've come back to the air freighting of lettuce, if you have to air freight lettuce in, or all your food, like some of the Arab states and Malta and places like that, then they've got a huge margin to play with of that 127 calories. But if we are to reach net zero, we've desperately got to actually reduce the overall energy used. And when you come back to the UK, Tesco will tell you that some of their crops, 65% of the cost is getting it to the shelf. And it's a bit like Pareto's law, the old 80-20 rule. Why actually focus on the 20%, in this case, the growing, when you can actually take out the 80% altogether? So there's many aspects around that where, and I think a lot of people dispute that 65%, but the reason for that is that a lot of people think of the trans-only packaging as part of growing. The final thing the grower does is pack into a box. But if you don't need to actually have a box to put it on a lorry, it therefore has to be a cost of distribution, and something that the consumer has no understanding of or recognition of. It makes no difference to the lettuce they buy in the supermarket, and they have no interest in it at all.
Yeah, we do. So I interviewed David Loveday, and we talked about the rising energy cost, the energy crisis, and we discussed it even further in the fact that everything's becoming a new normal. We're getting used to paying these costs for energy. We're getting used to paying the petrol prices, but we can't afford to do that because it's becoming a very big issue. I personally don't want to be paying £2 a litre for my fuel going forward. I love the fact that I was paying 99p once for my fuel, and I even threatened the petrol station owner that I'm going to frame that bill, and I wished I had done now because it was so cheap. So we've got to get away from the new normal, haven't we, and start pushing the barriers to get to where, looking at your form of technologies.
Well, much like the concept that we've rushed water out to sea so much faster, I think also the last 50 years we travel too far to get to work. We used to work locally, and of course the pandemic has actually achieved an enormous amount for the planet in terms of saying, well, actually you don't need to travel to work all the time. Exactly. And obviously here we are thousands of miles apart and almost as good as being face to face.
Exactly.
So there's aspects around that. We've got to reduce our dependency on energy. And funnily enough, for the planet, you could actually argue that energy is not expensive enough. And it's always bugged me that in the UK, we pay VAT on insulation materials and only a token gesture on energy, when really it ought to be the other way around.
So, Jonathan, it's come to that time where I like to put my guests on the spot, and you have been on the spot since we met. Is there anything that, based on what you've been telling us today, is there anything that you could give back personally to help experts around the world? Is there anything you can give back to them today as a takeaway?
Well, there's several aspects to that. I think from an investment point of view, people should take far more into account what they're really looking at, and rather than jumping on the bandwagon of others, they should actually look at what's needed by the planet. There's several aspects to that. Of course, I have my personal bugbears about it, and there's aspects around some of the research funding that I think becomes too focused. When you've got funders that, or those that are helping with grants and things like that, they suggest they should look at holistic and commercial outcomes, and then have people that look down at very narrow academic-minded PhD type studies of an individual aspect. It's a bit like rooftop solar PV, when in actual fact that's a simplistic. We've got to break down silos of big corporates, so we actually have a bigger considered view of there's no point in making a small incremental change on one person's specialism when in actual fact there are far better overall savings that can be made by actually a bit of collaboration and working together.
That was the first point. Was there another point?
Well, in many ways they're part and parcel of the same point. It's one of my bugbears that we don't look at the bigger picture.
Right, exactly. So, Jonathan, just lastly, what's your challenges at the moment with what you're doing? I wanted to ask that first of all, actually.
That's a good point. It's quite funny. I think a lot of companies out there talk about how difficult it is to recruit skilled staff. And yet we have a list of people who want to come to work for us. I think the young today want to work and be seen to be doing the right thing rather than, it's hysterically funny when you look back at the people that still complain about the mines being shut down. Where would that be now? To trying to get away from coal. So we've got to be working for an overall good. And unfortunately, I think there are still too many who fund individual specialisms rather than looking at these bigger pictures. So for us, our biggest issue is sensible funding.
Getting that money to go forward to make money for the organisations and to actually drive down the carbon footprint, which is the same story for all these forms of technology. So, Jonathan, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today on our podcast. It's been a different story from us point of view because, I'm normally focusing on, as I said before, on the scopes 1 and 2. I don't really look at all these other areas. And it's really good to hear that a different view on things and what we could be doing. And I'm sure our listeners will really like that as well. So I'd like to say thank you very much for coming along today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to spread my thoughts.
Brilliant. And that's probably a pun there, isn't there? Spreading.
Oh, there's all sorts of puns I could bring into this.
Jonathan, thank you. And please, you and your family stay safe in these times.
Thank you very much. And I hope everyone else is able to stay safe and that some things improve very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.